As with many other statements, do loops can be nested, and if you do nest them, each do loop will have its own SY index created and monitored by the system. But do be aware that when you start nesting do loops and other types of loops, you need to consider how much work you're going to make the system do. So let's get straight in and have a look at an example of how we nest another do loop inside this one. So first of all, well, I'll leave that breakpoint on, and then let's call this outer loop so we can monitor it properly. And then let's do our do loop statement inside. So we'll do, let's say, 10 times. And we'll do a similar type of statement. We will write out the value of b on its own line. I've remembered it this time. We'll call this inner loop. Let's just get it all in line. And don't forget, we need to declare our variable. Now, because we have a do loop inside our original do loop, let's initialize our variable b at this point. Because if we did it up here, its value would not be reset every time we got to the inner do loop. So by doing it here, we can do this second do loop 10 times, and then when the first do loop comes round to its second iteration, it gets reset to 0, and then it will count to 10 again in the second loop. And finally, let's just do one more little thing, just to count the total number of loops that we are processing. We'll have a variable called c, also of type I, and at the very end let's do this. We'll write out the value of c, but so it adds up correctly, what we need to do at the end of each second do loop is let c equal the value of b. So once it does 10 times, the value of b will be transferred to c. No, actually we need to do c plus b. So it gets added up every time. And then at the very end, we can do c plus a. So this should be a good counter for us to count up how many times the system loops through both loops. So the first loop is 15 times, and then in each loop it loops 10 more times. So we should, if my math's correct, have around about 150 loops. That's quite a lot of code being executed. Now, obviously we're using an SAP system and it's going to process this instantaneously. But you can imagine if you were processing through, let's say, 10,000 records at this level, and then you had 50,000 records at this second level, then 10,000 times 50,000, I can't do the maths, but it would equal a lot of iterations, and it could take quite a long time. So just be wary of nested loops. Anyway, let's get on and test our code. Our breakpoint is set here at line 22, so let's just execute it. And we'll bring up the values of A, give it a double click. Tell you what, change that to B, and we'll put C there. Now we will also bring up SY index at this point, and we can see that as a value of 0. And while we're processing through this code, keep an eye on SY index and notice how the value changes as we go from the outer loop to the inner loop. So let's get straight on and step through the code. So our first loop is going to be done 15 times. As we step into it, SY index equals 1. We will increment the value of A, write out our first statement, and we can see that B gets initialized. And now we're going to step into the second loop. SY index is 1 again, but because it's the first time we're going into this second loop, we don't actually see any change in the value, but SY index is pointing at the second loop now. It's monitoring this SY index value. As we step through, you'll see it change. So B is incremented by 1, we write out the statement, and now we're into the second iteration of the second loop, and we can see SY index is equal to. And as we step through, it should do it 10 times. So now we're in our 10th iteration of this inner loop. Goes back up, registers it's been done 10 times, jumps straight down to the end do statement, then processes the calculation of C. And then continues on in this first iteration of the outer loop. And we can see that and we can see that SY index has been changed back to 1. So we'll carry on. And now we're in the second loop of our outer do statement. And as we jump into our inner loop, SY index should be reset to represent the value of the inner loop. And so it is. So to save my fingers, all this key pressing, I'm just going to place a breakpoint on this line of code. Then I can press the F8 key, which is the same as this one, to zoom through. So we can see B, which is our inner loop, has been processed 10 times again. And C gets incremented to 20. And so on. I'll just press F8. I'll keep pressing it. And we can see our outer loop is going to be processed 15 times. Here we go. End do to the bottom. And then C gets incremented with the value of A. And we write out the final value of C. So we can see our outer loop, then the inner loop values, outer loop again, inner loop, and so on. As we scroll down to the bottom, we finally get the total number of loops that have been performed in our code. Now it might have been a little bit better if I was just to maybe increase the number of positions from the left-hand margin of the inner loop print. I'll double click the breakpoint to get rid of it. and then zoom through the code. There we go. That's easier to read. And there we go. So that's nesting do loops.